Whether we're using WPF or MAUI, I think we're all pretty sick of MVVM boilerplate, right? But this is where the MVVM Community Toolkit can save us. So if you haven't heard about it, the MVVM Community Toolkit is a package that allows us to reduce the boilerplate required to build MVVM applications. And it's quite magical, to be honest, in a good way. Now, I have talked about this in the past on my channel. I even did a live stream on it, but I haven't done an official practical video of using the MVVM toolkit. So that being said, what better way to show off the MVVM toolkit than by refactoring an old MVVM application to use the MVVM community toolkit. So let's see how smoothly this goes, and also how much code we get rid of and how much simpler things become by using the MVVM toolkit. So first off, I want to introduce the application that we're working with. So this is Reservim. We built this here on YouTube. There's a whole playlist on it. And this is a WPF MVVM application. We'll quickly demonstrate how this works. So we can view all of our reservations, we can make a reservation, and then once we submit this, our UI gets updated with our created reservation. Now, unfortunately, we did not use the MVVM Community Toolkit to build this, and there's just a lot of MVVM boilerplate here. I won't go into all of it because we're going to slowly work through and replace it. Make this application simpler with the MVVM Community Toolkit. So of course, let's first install the toolkit. So go to NuGet packages and search for the MVVM toolkit. And we want communitytoolkit.mvvm. So let's install that. Now the first enhancement we can make is leveraging this observable object. So this is a base class that implements iNotifyPropertyChanged for us so that we don't need our own base class that has that, which we do. So we have this viewModel base implements iNotifyPropertyChanged. So let's delete this. And let's update all of our viewModels to use ObservableObject instead of our hand-rolled viewModel base. So let's go through and update this. And of course, this ObservableObject implements all of the helper methods that we need, such as onPropertyChanged. We can even look at this. This interface is much more advanced and powerful than what we were rolling ourselves. And in fact, we are going to leverage some of these helper methods down the road. But let's update the rest of our viewModels. Inherit from ObservableObject. And we have an issue here. So our old viewModel base implemented iDisposable because there are cases where we want to dispose of viewModel when we're no longer using it. So when we move to the next page of our application, we dispose the previous viewModel. But ObservableObject doesn't implement iDisposable, so we can't access this dispose method. That's somewhat unfortunate, but as we move more into bracing the community toolkit, we really won't need to be disposing anything. So we're going to comment this out for now. And we'll come back to this once we're leveraging more things in the community toolkit and implement something that makes sense. And back in a viewModel, this goes back to the disposable issue, no longer implementing iDisposable on our viewModels. So let's just remove this override. And again, we'll come back to disposing later. And our application still builds successfully. So using ObservableObject, that's a pretty minor enhancement. Let's move on to something more powerful. So you might notice in our viewModels and in any MVVM application, there's a lot of bloat just for the sake of adding a property that you want to bind to. But with the MVVM toolkit, we don't need any of it. Instead, there's a magical observable property attribute that turns any field into a property that we can bind to that raises onPropertyChanged in the setter. So on our error message, let's add the observable property attribute. And the way this attribute works is it's going to generate this property via source generators on a partial of our viewModel. So we're going to have to make this a partial class. And then if we want parity with the previous behavior, not only do we want to raise onPropertyChanged for error message, we also want to raise it for has error message. So to do that, we can leverage another attribute NotifyPropertyChangedFor and then the dependent property. So let's define that attribute and then point to our has error message property. And with that, we can get rid of our massive bloaty property. And then same thing for isLoading. This one is much simpler. We can just delete that, no dependencies. And now moving on to our other viewModel, the make reservation viewModel, we can add the observable property attribute here, make our class a partial, of course. And then we also have a dependent property here. So we're going to notify property changed for the can create reservation property. But in this setter, we have more than just dependent property changes that we're firing. We also have some validation. And we are going to get into doing validation the MVVM toolkit way. But for now, let's leverage an override that this observable property attribute creates. So if we look at our class, we can override on username changing, and we're going to get the value that we're changing to. We can move all of our validation into here. Let's delete our old property and rely on the source generated one. And now we can't read has username here to check if our username is valid, because as we can see, this reads the username property. But here, we're inside of on username changing. So our username property hasn't been updated yet. And instead, this value represents the username that we're eventually going to update the username property with. So instead, for now, let's just add our validation inside of here instead of checking this property. And our username is invalid if it is null or empty. And whoops, I did not know we would get a warning just for naming our parameters differently. So okay, let's change this back to value. That is fine, I suppose. And lastly, let's decorate the rest of our properties with the ObservableProperty attribute. And we're going to need custom validation again. This is all going to follow the same pattern that we just did for the username. So I'm going to do this real quick off camera. So here we go. We're leveraging the ObservableProperty attributes. We have our custom validation within these property changing overrides, and our validation seems to be working. There we go. Looks good. So now let's move into commands. So historically, I've been a big fan of class commands where I'll implement my commands as classes outside of the viewmodel. And I used to do this all the time because adding commands to viewmodels was very bloaty. So I wanted to move that bloat to an external class so that my viewmodels weren't cluttered. But with the MVVM toolkit, we get this handy relay command attribute where we can turn any method into a relay command. So it works similar to the ObservableProperty attribute where it uses source generators and generates a partial class in the background with the command that we eventually bind to. So I love these, way less boilerplate. Let's use it. So let's start with this simple make reservation command. This is a command that navigates us from that listing page to the make reservation form. So let's define a method to make a reservation, and that's going to take this make reservation navigation service. So let's put that into a field. And now to make a reservation, we're going to take that navigation service and navigate. And now this is going to be our command. So let's turn this method into a command with the relay command attribute. Let's remove our old command. And as expected, the make reservation button still behaves, still navigates us to the next page. Now let's do this load reservations command as well. This one's pretty simple too. So we're going to have a relay command. Now this one's going to be async. So let's see what happens here. It's going to be an async task to load reservations. Let's dig into this command and just cut out everything. I don't know why I'm getting so many errors. I guess these are supposed to be on that generated partial class, but maybe it's not picking that up. Haven't seen that before, but let's copy this out of the load reservations command, paste that in here. We're inside of our viewmodel, so we don't need to reference that from our command, which makes more sense. I do like having this within the viewmodel. It's much more cohesive. And now let's delete our commands property. We no longer need that. And even though this is an async task, our relay command is going to turn this into an async command under the hood. So it doesn't matter if it's a void or an async method. All you got to do is throw the relay command attribute on top of it, and boom, it's a command. And our reservations still load. So let's move over to the make reservation viewmodel. This is our only other viewmodel that has commands as well. Let's turn this cancel command into a relay command. This is just navigation similar to what we just did. So I'll do this off camera real quick. There we go, pretty simple. And now this submit command is going to be a little bit more advanced. Let's get rid of this and start creating our command. That's going to be async for submitting. Call it submit. Throw our relay command attribute on top. Delete our old command reference. And let's go over to our make reservation command, which the submit command was binding to. And let's copy over all of this execute logic, paste it in our viewmodel, remove these viewmodel references since we're inside of the viewmodel. So our submit command looks good, but we don't have parity with our old make reservation command. So as we can see, this also had some can execute dependencies. So we can only execute this command if we can create a reservation. So we're dependent on this property on our viewmodel in order to execute the command. So if this is false, we can't execute the command. So how do we do this with the relay command attribute? Well, it's Pretty easy. So there's a CanExecute property we can set on this attribute, and we can just point that to the property we depend on, CanCreateReservation. So that's good, but still one more missing piece. So as we can see in this old make reservation command, we were manually raising on CanExecuteChanged so that our UI will recheck this value of CanExecute. We were doing that whenever CanCreateReservation changed. So we need to also do that in our view model. And there's another attribute for that. So there's a NotifyCanExecuteChangedFor attribute, and we can point to our submit command. And we want to add this because whenever CanCreateReservation changes, we want our submit command to recheck if it can execute. But the issue is we can't add this attribute to this calculated property, unfortunately. You can only add these attributes to fields. So we are unfortunately going to have to add this to all of the data fields that make up this calculated property. So that would be the end date, the start date, the floor number, and the username. So not too bad. While I'm here, I want to fix these properties that I missed, so turn these into observable properties. This one needs to NotifyPropertyChangedFor has submit error message, because we have a dependency here. Let's delete this. And then this one's an observable property too. Get rid of that. Much better. And now our submit command should work. So as we can see, CanExecute is getting fired successfully as our data changes. There we go. It becomes disabled and then re-enables when we get valid data. So let's submit this, create a reservation, and the command works as expected. Let's actually delete these old commands because we want to see how much code we're saving. How much boilerplate is the toolkit getting rid of? And actually, we don't need any of these base commands either. So no more commands folder. Cool. So next up, I want to get into events via the messenger that the community toolkit provides. So right now we expose an event on our hotel store whenever a reservation is made, and we update our reservation listing view and add the new reservation. But anyways, the community toolkit provides a messenger that allows us to communicate between view models, stores, etc. without leveraging events. So we get much more looser coupling than events suggest, and we'll see that in action. So rather than using events here, we're going to take the MVVM Toolkit messenger and register to some sort of event, something like a reservation made message, and then we're going to send that message with the created reservation from somewhere else in our application. So first off, we're going to have to create that message that's going to contain the created reservation. So we'll create a class, call this the reservation made message. Let's inherit from value changed message, which is a nice little helper base class that'll add a property to our message with the data that we want to pass. So in this case, we want to pass a reservation, and let's generate a constructor that represents that. So we're going to get a reservation passed through the constructor, pass it down to this base class, and all this base class does is exposes a value property with our data, which in this case is the reservation that we want to pass around. So now in our hotel store, let's get rid of this event that we're using. And instead of firing that event, we're going to take the strong reference messenger, just grab the default instance. We could also constructor inject an iMessenger interface and reference it that way, but I'm fine using the singleton instance here. And we're going to send out a new reservation made message with our created reservation. So no longer firing the event here. So now in our reservation listing view model, instead of subscribing to this event, we're instead going to receive the message. So we're going to take the messenger, grab the default instance, and register this view model. But in order to register this to handle this message, our view model needs to implement the iRecipient interface for this message. So let's add that. We're going to be an iRecipient for the reservation made message, which means we need to implement a method that handles this message. So let's implement this receive method. Let's move this up to where we're working with. And whenever we receive this message type, we want to turn that into a view model and add that to our list of reservations that we display on the UI. Let's grab that reservation value off of our message, delete our old handler. Now here's where we get into disposing. So we registered this view model to handle this message, but we need to unregister when appropriate. And this is where the observable recipient can help us a lot here. So this works pretty closely with the iRecipient interface that we just implemented for our message, and most importantly, it exposes an isActive property. So whenever we set our viewModel to be active, then it calls onActivated, and onActivated registers all of our message handlers that we define with the iRecipient interface. And on the contrary, whenever we call isActive to false, that fires on deactivated and automatically unregisters all of our recipient message handlers. So let's leverage this pattern to register and clean up our message handlers. So on our viewModel, let's inherit from ObservableRecipient instead of ObservableObject, and we can replace that because ObservableRecipient inherits from ObservableObject already. So we're not losing out on our reactivity here. And now, as mentioned, we're automatically going to register these message handlers whenever isActive is true on our viewModel. So whenever this property is active, when the ObservableRecipient is true, this will get registered for us. So we don't need any of this. We don't need disposing because on deactivated, whenever isActive is false, will automatically clean up our message handler subscriptions. But there is one issue here, and that is we're not controlling when isActive is set to true or false, and when our viewModel should register and unregister our message handlers. So the appropriate place I feel to do this is whenever the current viewModel of our application changes. So whenever we get a new viewModel and that viewModel is not null, we want to take that and set isActive to true. And whenever we're moving away from a viewModel, we want to take that viewModel and set isActive to false to essentially clean up those message subscriptions before we replace the viewModel and it gets garbage collected. But the only issue is that we're referencing an observable object here instead of an observable recipient. And this is why I feel like any page level viewModel should be an observable recipient, because it's very likely that a page level viewModel is going to be interacting with message handlers and is going to have to be initialized and cleaned up at some point. So I feel pretty good about this. Let's update our other page level viewModels to be observable recipients as well. So no big deal here. All right, so I don't know what's going on. Maybe the documentation is outdated or something, but I could only hit this breakpoint whenever I manually registered my message handlers with the messenger. Or maybe it's because I'm using the strong reference messenger. Not too sure, but maybe it is a good idea to explicitly register and unregister these messages ourselves. And make sure onActivated and onDeactivated get hit accordingly. So move to the next page and we deactivate and unregister our messages. There we go, much better. All right, so continuing the pilot on, the last thing we're going to talk about here is validation. So in our make reservation viewModel for the make reservation form, we have a lot of custom validation in here. And we have our own manual implementation of NotifyDataErrorInfo. So we even have a bunch of helpers. If we scroll down here for adding an error, getting all the errors, clearing errors, etc. And if you're not familiar with NotifyDataErrorInfo, that's basically the modern WPF solution to validation. So we can hook into this interface from our UI and display error messages. But as we see, it's a lot of boilerplate to implement this interface and some of this validation. Some of it's not very advanced and could be simplified. And this is where the ObservableValidator can help us. So it's a base class that essentially implements NotifyDataErrorInfo for us, exposes a bunch of helper methods to interact with NotifyDataErrorInfo, and even better, it exposes validation attributes for some of these simple validations so that we don't have to roll them ourselves. So let's dig into it. Let's inherit from ObservableValidator, and oh no, we have an issue. So this is a page level viewModel, which we previously discussed should inherit from ObservableRecipient, but we can't do that because we're inheriting from ObservableValidator so that we can get our NotifyDataErrorInfo base implementation. So obviously C#, it's a good language. We can't do multiple inheritance. So luckily we can use an attribute so that we can get all of the ObservableRecipient base code into our ObservableValidator. So let's do that. We'll add that attribute ObservableRecipient. The only issue is that this is still not an observable recipient, which our navigation requires. So we're not going to be able to set the make reservation viewModel in our navigation stored to the current viewModel because, again, it's not an observable recipient. Even though it has this attribute, it is an observable validator. But since we have this attribute, we get all of the properties that the observable recipient exposes. So we get the isActive property. That's good. And that isActive property is really all we need on our navigation store for navigation. So no big deal. We can just have a custom interface that enforces our page level view models to have this isActive property and also probably implement NotifyPropertyChanged. So let's add that real quick. No big deal. Kind of annoying, but that's just the way it goes when we're trying to get all these base classes. We're trying to get rid of boilerplate. There's going to be conflicts. There's going to be slight weird things like this. But as always, we can solve it with an interface. So we're going to have an iPage view model. And this should implement NotifyPropertyChanged, which our page view models do. And this should expose an isActive property that we can get and set. So pretty cool. Let's update our navigation store to reference this. And lastly, our page level view models just need to implement this interface, which they already do because ObservableRecipient, which both of these view models contain, have all of the properties and behavior that this interface requires. So now we took care of that and we can get back to validation. So we're inheriting from ObservableValidator on our view model, which means we don't need to implement NotifyDataErrorInfo, or at least explicitly implement it because this base class implements it for us. We shouldn't need these helper methods. I don't think we'll need any of them, actually. So let's just get rid of all of these. Don't need the has errors property that's implemented on the base class. Same with the errors changed event. So cutting out a lot of code here. This is nice. But now we need to implement our validation. So instead of our custom utilities and all this one for username is pretty straightforward. This is basically just required validation. So username is required. And I believe we can specify an error message. So username cannot be empty. Boom. Let's get rid of this validation bloat. And now for the floor number, this needs to be greater than 0. So for this, I think we can just use the range attribute, set the minimum to 1, and then set the maximum to double max value. And for our error message, floor number must be greater than 0. There we go. Less custom validation. Cool. But now this custom validation for the start date having to be before the end date, this is a little bit advanced because we're depending on another property and we are going to need to define some custom validation. So luckily there is a custom validation attribute and our validator type is going to be this view model. So we're going to put our validation as a method within this class, and this should be type of, not name of. And the name of the method that's going to perform the validation, we need to add. We'll call this method start date before end date. And let's add our error message. So the start date cannot be after the end date. And same validation for our end date whenever that changes, just a different message. The end date cannot be before the start date. So in the MVVM Community Toolkit docs, they give an example of what a custom validation looks like. Let's just copy this and we'll adjust it to our use case. So let's get rid of our old validation and add this. Our method is start date before end date. Maybe we should prefix this with validate. So validate the start date is before the end date. So this custom validator gets a validation context. It has an object instance that represents the object that we're validating from. So we're validating from our make reservation view model. And we really do need to dig into this object instance property because this method is static. So we're not going to be able to access any of these property values from inside this static method. We got to use this instance here. So let's call this view model. So if our view model start date is before the view model end date, then our validation succeeds. If not, our validation fails and we'll give a message of start date is not before end date. And I don't think this message should matter because we're defining our own message on the validation attribute, which should override that. So we shall see. Let's get rid of our last custom validation. There we go. Everything is powered by attributes now. We don't have any NotifyDataErrorInfo boilerplate in here. Uh-oh. So we got an error activating our make reservation view model. And it looks like we set isActive to true. We call it onActivated. And our messenger was null. So why was our messenger null? So it looks like there is a property for the messenger. It's read only. Do we need to set this ourselves? All right, so let's read more about this ObservableRecipient attribute, learn a little bit All right, so not gonna lie, I am a little bit confused because the messenger, looking at the property, I only see a getter, but it looks like we can set it. So maybe this is the public interface where we only see the getter, and maybe like the private interface has the setter, not sure. Is this gonna work? There we go, it does work. We land on the make reservation page. Okay, so all is good. Even though we got 404s on the documentation, we figured it out. So let's test our validation, adding a username, and there we go. Our validation doesn't fire. Oh, and I forgot. So when we're using these custom validation attributes, we need to call setProperty with this boolean true so that we fire validation when the property changes. So it looks like we need a full property for this, except we're using the ObservableProperty attribute, which has yet another attribute that tells the property to validate when we change. So we have this NotifyDataErrorInfo, which under the hood is going to do something similar to this and do the validation when we set the property. So no big deal. Let's add that to our properties, or at least just the properties that require validation. And this should work. All right, so remove a username and okay. It is validating. It is working. The only issue is that we get this error border around our entire form. I think that's just something on the UI that I'm gonna have to fix. But okay, this validation is working. It's required. Floor number, yep, less than 0. So that works. Make it greater than 0 and no validation error. Now the custom validation. So let's try and make this a date after the end date. There we go. Validation fires. Let's make the end date valid. And oh, we don't update the validation there. So we want to call validation again whenever the end date becomes valid because of this other property. All right, so I'm not sure we can get this dependent validation to work with attributes, but we could override something like on start date changed, and then use one of these utility methods on the base class. So validate property, passing in the end date value, and we want to validate the end date property. So I think this should work. Let's add it to end date as well while we're here. So when the end date changed, let's revalidate the start date property. All right, so that kind of works. We get errors on both date pickers, but that's not too bad. It kind of makes sense. In reality, both of these are invalid. I think if we really wanted to only highlight one at a time, we probably could implement that with some of these utility methods that the base class exposes. But in my opinion, I'm totally fine with this behavior. And with that, I think we've heavily refactored this to use the MVVM Community Toolkit. Now, keep in mind there was a lot done here, and if you're using the MVVM Toolkit, you don't have to use everything. So for example, you might just love this observable property attribute to turn fields into observable properties without the boilerplate, but you might not really love the whole messenger thing, and you might feel comfortable with using .NET events instead, which is totally fine. But anyways, what I'm getting at is that the MVVM Toolkit, you can pick and choose whatever you want in your own application. You don't have to use everything. Just use whatever you think is right to reduce the boilerplate issues that you have in your own application. So I committed the changes from this video and pushed this up to GitHub. And looking at the diff, so we added 173 lines of code, deleted 448. That's a diff of almost like 250, 300 lines. And that's all just from using the MVVM Community Toolkit. And this application isn't even that big. If we had a bigger application, then this could expand to be like exponentially more code reduction. So pretty awesome stuff here. So overall, consider refactoring your own application to the Community MVVM Toolkit, or at least building future applications with the MVVM Toolkit. You'll reduce boilerplate, reduce lines of code, speed up your development of MVVM applications, because you're not going to be all worried about the boilerplate and all of these base classes that the toolkit already gives us. Now, keep in mind, if you are learning WPF or MAUI, it might be a good idea to roll these base classes on your own and not use the toolkit, just so that you can get a feel of what these base classes in the toolkit are doing, and so that you can learn more of the fundamentals of various MVVM principles. But aside from that, consider using the MVVM Community Toolkit in your own .NET MVVM application for a delightful MVVM experience.